Hi there, it's Chris Trimble coming at you from the lovely campus of Dartmouth College, and I'm here to talk to you today about the core messages in our book, How Stella Saved the Farm. Just a couple of administrative things before we get started. First, and importantly, a spoiler alert. You really don't want to watch this video until after you've read the book. You'll enjoy both the book and the video much more if you do it in that order. And also, if you have an upcoming discussion with others who are reading the book concurrently with you, you want to wait until after that group discussion before watching this video. Secondly, this is a two-part video, and if you're pressed for time, really the core messages that I want to talk to you about today are all in part one. We'll describe the basic prescription for innovation that is at the core of How Stella Saved the Farm. In part two, some of you will be interested in hearing what the most common objection to that prescription is, and I'll talk about that in the second half of the video. But for now, let's dive right into the mystery that is at the core of this book. You as the reader are asked over and over again, who really saved the farm? Was it Deirdre? Or Maverick, or Bull, maybe Stella? After all, the book was named How Stella Saved the Farm. Who saved the farm? Well, here's the answer. It was the team that saved the farm. Everybody made an important contribution. Now that sounds like a very plain, vanilla observation, but it's really not, because we have a certain mindset about how innovation really happens, and it's very widespread. And to sort of describe that mindset to you, I'd like to share the two most common questions I get when I go out on the road and I give presentations about innovation. The first question, Chris, how can I identify the real innovation heroes in my organization? The second question, how can I knock down at least some of the barriers that they face? You see, we tend to frame the innovation challenge as a battle between a hero, let's call him Innovation Man, and a bureaucratic enemy, a bureaucratic octopus. We tend to imagine that innovation is about brilliant people with brilliant ideas who pursue their dream at most any expense, people who are ready to overcome any barrier, fight anyone that stands in their way to bring their vision to fruition. This is very deeply cemented in the way we think about innovation, and I believe that it's a problem. Now, to see why it's a problem, let's describe the innovation challenge just a little bit more accurately. First of all, innovation is a two-part challenge. Part one is ideas, part two, execution. Now, these two parts are very dissimilar. They have almost nothing to do with each other. I will agree with you that one person can come up with a brilliant idea. But can one person execute? And to be a little bit more specific, because Stella is about innovation in established organizations, the execution challenge is not just one challenge, but two challenges. What you have to do is do two things at once. And these two things are a lot harder than just walking and chewing gum. We're talking about building something new and at the same time sustaining excellence in what already exists. As I said, this is harder than walking and chewing gum. That's because these two activities are very distinct, and not only that, very often in conflict. And so that's why I think the hero model for innovation is pure fantasy. The fundamental message of the book, How Stella Saved the Farm, is that it takes a special kind of team to make innovation happen. Now, the message is not just about teamwork in the vanilla sense of the word. It is, in fact, about how to build a team with a very specific structure. Indeed, the job that this book does is very much analogous to what you would do if you were to bring a group of people from abroad to the United States or another baseball-loving country and teach people who had never heard of the sport about the game. You wouldn't spend a lot of time talking about teamwork in general. You would talk about the specifics of how a baseball team works. What does the pitcher do? What does the catcher do? The first baseman, the outfielders. Describing how an innovation team works effectively is exactly the same way. This is where we are in management today. We need to get much better at understanding how successful innovation teams are built. That's what Stella is all about. And the reason that this is a tough challenge is that organizations are not designed for innovation. They are designed first and foremost to be performance engines. That is, they are designed to excel at ongoing operations, to serve today's customers, to fight today's rivals, to be efficient, to be accountable, to be on spec, on budget, and on time every day, every week, and every month. And of course, to deliver those bottom line profits. Now let me be clear that although this is intuitively in conflict with innovation in many ways, a well-run performance engine is a very good thing. In fact, the management profession has mastered, I would argue, the art of building good performance engines. And as a result, we've raised living standards around the world. So don't get me wrong, a performance engine is a very good thing, and great companies run great performance engines. But there's a lot of conflict here. And if you want to see those conflicts in their most fundamental form, all you have to understand is the method of the performance engine, which is the same no matter where you go. And that method is to make every task, every process, and every activity as repeatable and as predictable as possible. There's great power in both. This is how you get consistent, reliable results. There's just one small problem. Innovation is practically by definition exactly the opposite. Every innovation initiative is by nature non-routine and uncertain. Now these are fundamental incompatibilities, and they strike right at the heart of how managers are trained and how organizations are structured. And just to add a little bit more degree of difficulty here, let's recognize that we're trying to make innovation happen in organizations that are almost entirely dedicated to ongoing operations. Resources for innovation are always scarce. So I think we've defined the nature of this problem now. What's the solution? How do you simultaneously build something new and sustain excellence in what already exists? And the answer is you need a very special kind of team. And that team always is two groups of people that work in partnership. It's not one group, it's two groups in partnership. One of the groups is dedicated full time to a single innovation initiative. I'll call that group the dedicated team. The other group works on the innovation initiative only part-time. And with the rest of their time, they're continuing to be involved in day-to-day operations. We'll call that group the shared staff. So the team is always a partnership between people working on an innovation initiative full-time and those working on it part-time. Dedicated team, shared staff. I like this diagram to convey how this team is built and how it operates. Let's start over on the left with the shared staff. Now, very deliberately, I've chosen a dark blue square for the shared staff, same as the performance engine. And that's because the shared staff remains an integral piece of the performance engine. Very little changes. Everybody remains in their existing jobs. Everybody reports to the same boss. Indeed, because the shared staff remains responsible for ongoing operations, you have very little flexibility here. You can ask the shared staff to do more work, provided you give it adequate resources to do so. But what you have to be very careful not to do is ask the shared staff to do very different work. When you do that, it's very disruptive, and either innovation or ongoing operations fails, one or the other. Shared staff can do more, but not different. To be just a little bit more specific, you want to ask the shared staff to take on tasks only that are familiar or quickly learned, those that fit into existing workflows, those that fit into existing roles and responsibilities. On the farm, the team had a little bit of trouble figuring out what the shared staff could do. They discovered the shared staff could not handle yarn making operations, okay, but it could handle animal care. So you want to be very careful about what you ask the shared staff to do. Let's now go over to the right side, to the dedicated team. Notice here we're using a diamond. It's as though we've taken that square and literally turned it on its side. And that's very deliberate, because the right way to think about building the dedicated team is to imagine you're building a brand new company from the ground up. You have almost no flexibility on the shared staff side, but you have, in theory, infinite flexibility on the dedicated team side. You can bring in new people from the outside. You can create entirely new roles and responsibilities and structures and hierarchies, new processes, new metrics, a distinct culture. You build the dedicated team as though you're building a new company from the ground up. And that is so critical, because you simply do not get breakthrough innovation without at least a little bit of breakthrough organizational design. You absolutely cannot do breakthrough organizational design in the shared staff without breaking ongoing operations. But you can do it in the dedicated team. Finally, let's take a look at this partnership. Now, this is always a delicate partnership to manage, because innovation and day-to-day operations are inevitably in conflict. And because if you build the dedicated team right, it's very different from the shared staff. It's a delicate partnership, but you must make it work. To give up on this partnership is to give up on innovation itself. Now, I've added a generic org chart here. And starting center right, you've got the project leader. That's the one person that is responsible for the innovation initiative most of all. And they therefore have both the shared staff and the dedicated team reporting to them. But then it's not too hard to see where the conflict lies, because the shared staff also must continue to report to the existing chain of command. Maybe that's a functional lead, then a general manager. Now, because there's conflict, we know the project leader and the general manager are always going to be at odds with each other. Unfortunately, left unsupervised, the general manager always wins. He's got more power, more resources, shorter-term deadlines, more concrete needs. The project leader, meanwhile, has a long-term and uncertain aspiration. So the only way this model works is when there's an even more powerful force in the mix. A senior leader that understands that it is their job to adjudicate actively the conflicts that arise between innovation and ongoing operations. That's the team model. I'm going to show you quickly now a few different ways to get it wrong. Number one is not to recognize the need for the dedicated team, to imagine that the performance engine can do it all. Well, it just can't. Another common error is to see the need for a dedicated team, but to treat it like a skunkworks, a completely separate operation. Another city, another office, no interaction with the performance engine. This may be a good way to get an innovation initiative started. But when you do this, you forfeit the one and only advantage you have as an established company over an independent startup. And that is your ability to build on what already exists, to leverage your established and powerful assets. A third common error is to try and bring about too much change. Hey, our performance engine can't innovate. Let's reorganize. This is going way too far. I want you to see that the model that we've developed here and illustrate in How Stella Saved the Farm is one for very limited and targeted change. It is one for making innovation happen while doing no harm to day-to-day operations. The final three common errors all are ones where you get the basic partnership model right but don't quite execute it well enough. Very common to ask the shared staff to do too much, and that's what's illustrated here. The shared staff is very limited in its capabilities because of the demands on it to excel every day in ongoing operations. It's tempting to ask the shared staff to do a lot of work because it already exists. You don't have to build it. But it's dangerous be very careful there. Another common error is to get the division of labor right, but to build, instead of a real functional dedicated team, what I sometimes call a little performance engine. That's a small group of people that unfortunately behaves just like the parent organization. This is an especially likely misstep when you staff that dedicated team entirely with insiders who've worked together for a while. They're almost guaranteed in that context to keep operating in much the same way. Finally, is to do everything right, but not to carefully manage the partnership. The partnership will only thrive with a lot of active engagement from the top, with the right kind of innovation leader, one that values the partnership, and with some careful thinking about the incentives on both sides of this partnership. What you want is this: a dedicated team and a shared staff working in a healthy partnership with each other. And this is exactly what we illustrate in the parable, How Stella Saved the Farm. In fact, you can take all the characters on the farm and put them on the org chart that I showed you earlier. You can see right away where Deirdre and Einstein and Bull and Rambo and Mav and all the other characters on the farm fit in. So what this book allows you to do is sort of walk in the shoes of each person on the team and empathize with the pressures they're under and understand what it's like to be them. And that is so important because this team only works when everybody understands and empathizes with and respects everybody else's job. Well, how do you build that understanding? Well, get your team to read Stella and then talk about it. This is a very, very easy thing to do. In fact, all you really have to do is get everybody around the table and instigate a little debate about who really saved the farm. Just take the time to make the best possible argument you can for each character, and this core lesson of the book, that it takes a team, not just any team, but a team structured in a very specific way, that core message will come shining through from this very simple technique. You'll find lots more on the website, www.howstellasavedthefarm.com, including discussion guides that'll tell you just a little bit more about how to lead this very simple discussion. So that's it. That is the core message from How Stella Saved the Farm. It takes a team, not just any team, but a team that's structured in a very specific way. Those of you pressed for time, I'll say goodbye and thank you for listening in today. Thanks for taking in this video. Those of you with some additional time and some curiosity, stick with me. Because what I'm going to do next is address the most common objection to this notion of building a dedicated team that works in partnership with the shared staff. And that, quite simply, is that a dedicated team for one innovation initiative, that seems like a very heavy and very expensive approach to making things happen. Is that always necessary? Well, the answer is no, it's not always necessary. But it's necessary far more often than companies recognize. So what I'd like to do with our remaining time together is help you recognize when it is necessary. First off, though, let's be very clear that what I'm proposing here is taking a certain amount of labor, work that needs to be done to execute an innovation initiative, and dividing that between some people that are working on it full-time and some people that are working on it part-time. I guess the alternative is to have only part-timers involved. Of course, you'd need a lot more of them. If it's if we can define the amount of resources involved in the project, you'd need far more part-timers. It would still cost the same amount if you account for it carefully with all part-timers, instead of far fewer part-timers and a small dedicated team. That's really the distinction, and I think the resistance comes from the fact that the dedicated team, when you make that choice, it's a very visible choice. You can't hide it anywhere. It's going to show up on somebody's P&L. With part-timers, it's like magic. Maybe it doesn't show up on anybody's P&L. It's almost as though it's free. So that's the appeal, and yet we're still talking about the same amount of resources. What I'm proposing is not that radical. simply that more of the people that work on an innovation initiative are full-time and fewer of them are part-time. Nonetheless, let's go a little bit deeper into this question about when is a dedicated team necessary. And to do that, it's necessary to take just a moment to define what we mean by innovation. And this can seem complicated because there's all kinds of categories of innovation out there. You've heard there's a difference between a sustaining and a disruptive innovation. We could talk about incremental versus radical innovation, and it goes on and on. For our purposes today, though, none of this matters. All these categories are useful on this side of innovation, on the idea side, when you're trying to define an idea and estimate its potential impact and select the best of several ideas, define your strategy. Hey, when you're doing those sorts of things, these categories matter. But when it comes time to execute, they don't. And that's going to allow us to go with a very simple definition of an innovation initiative. It is any project that is new to you and has an uncertain outcome. That's it. Project, that's an important word because ideas become projects in that two-part process we talked about, ideas and execution. So what we're talking about today really is project management. We just happen to be talking about very high degree of difficulty projects because they are new and because they are uncertain. I'm going to go just one small step further on our definition and suggest that you can take all these initiatives and put them on a spectrum, from those that are relatively easy on the left to those that are quite a bit harder on the right. We'll come back to that spectrum shortly, but for now, no matter where you are on the spectrum, you're going to need resources. And that's obviously a very plain observation, but let's recognize that once again, resources are constrained. They're very limited. In fact, if you look at all of the resources in an organization, most of them are dedicated to ongoing operations, only some to innovation. So we've got to be very careful with how we think about where these resources are coming from. And in fact, one of those resources that we need to be particularly careful about thinking about is just people and their time. Because most innovation initiatives get started with just a few people and their time. I find it very helpful to visualize this question on a chart. This is like a pie chart, except that it's a rectangle. On the x-axis are all the people in the organization. On the y-axis, all of their time. Now this pie, if you will, is going to get divided between ongoing operations and innovation. Let's go ahead and put ongoing operations up here first. I figure it looks something like this. Right? So what we're seeing already is that somehow we've got to squeeze innovation into the little slivers of slack time at the top of the chart here. That last 4 or 5% of everybody's time at the end of the week that's available perhaps once the day-to-day work gets done. So one way we could squeeze innovation in is ask everybody to contribute part-time. Another option is we could ask just a smaller number of people to contribute perhaps a little bit more time. And then a third option might be, hey, let's carve out a dedicated team, a small group of people that are working on innovation all the time. We could, of course, go with some combination of these approaches as well. But let's be very clear that innovation depends on leftover resources, and especially leftover people and their time, if you will. Now, the key to success is to assign the right tasks to the right people, full-time and part-time. Think very carefully about what you ask full-time people to do and part-time people to do. I'm not talking full-time employees and part-time employees, but those that are working on innovation full-time and those that are doing so part-time. What we've seen in our work is that there are 3 and only 3 ways to think about this that make sense. 3 models. Now, all 3 of these models are powerful. All 3 of them are important. And not only that, you don't have to choose. You can have all 3 of these models going at the same time in your company. What you do have to do, however, is match the right project to the right model each and every time. And to do that well, you have to recognize there are sharp physical limits with how far you can go with the first two models. Let's give these models names. I'm going to call them Model S, Model R, and Model C. It's the first two, Models S and Model R, that have some sharp limits that I'll describe shortly. It's the third one, Model C, that is described in the parable, How Stella Saved the Farm. We'll come back to Model C shortly, but let's take a close look at Model S and Model R, because it's only when these two fall short that we need the model I described earlier, the dedicated team working in partnership with the shared staff. Now, by now, you're almost certainly wondering, why are they called S, R, and C? Well, S is for small innovation initiatives, R is for repeatable innovation initiatives, C is for custom innovation initiatives. Hold that in your head, it'll make much more sense shortly. Let's start with Model S. The basic idea with Model S is that we can create a culture of innovation. In a culture of innovation, anybody can be an innovator every single day. Everybody innovates. Everybody can come up with ideas. Everybody can even take some initiative to make things happen. In Model S, the key to success is motivation, because you're asking everybody not just to do one job, but two. As has often been said before, your job is not just to do your work, but to figure out how to improve your work. This is an important model and a powerful model. If you look at it just a little bit more closely, you'll see that with Model S, we're asking those who are working on innovation only part-time to be the prime movers, to take initiative, to make things happen. Where there is a full-time team involved, they're there to provide support. These teams might be quality assurance teams or Six Sigma teams or continuous improvement teams. They go by lots of names. But they're there to motivate the front lines, to make innovation happen, to provide support, perhaps by doing some analysis to figure out where the biggest opportunities are, or whether a certain improvement or a certain idea has actually yielded better performance. They might even be involved in moving good ideas around the organization. But it is the part-timers that are making things happen, taking initiative. The limitation for Model S is actually really clear if you think about it. It's just that people are very busy. Model S is a model for squeezing innovation into those tiny little slivers of slack time that exist in every organization. And that can be done just so long as we're talking about small projects. Anything that's bigger than what one person or at most a handful of people can do in their slack time is just too big for this approach. Now, Model R will get us beyond that limit. Model R, the basic idea is, let's make innovation look as much like ongoing operations as possible. Let's script the process. Let's make it efficient. Let's make it routine. And any company that routinely brings out new products and services, new versions, okay, this year's versions of last year's product, probably has a Model R process in place. In fact, the key to Model R is to make that process as efficient as possible. This is a powerful model. It works. If you look at it a little bit more closely, what you'll see is that those working on innovation full-time are typically in development roles. They're the inventors, the product developers that come up with new products and services. And then those working on innovation part-time are in commercialization roles. And they're in sales, they're in marketing, they're in manufacturing. And they do new products and old products side by side. They can handle both at the same time. While this is a powerful model, in some sense it is its own enemy. Because the better you get at Model R, the more efficient you get at Model R, the narrower the capability becomes. The more specialized your innovation capability becomes, to the point that all you can really do is continuously bring out this year's version of last year's product. Now, in some industries, it's absolutely critical to do that and do that really, really well. But there is a limit. And when you want to get beyond the limits of this year's version of last year's product, that's when you're going to need Model C, the model that we illustrated in How Stella Saved the Farm. And you know what? All I presented earlier was just another way to think about dividing the labor between those working on innovation and those working on full-time and those working on innovation part-time. You can easily compare the three different approaches. Right? Each of the three has a different model for dividing the work between those working on innovation part-time and those working on it full-time. In Model C, those working on it part-time only take on familiar tasks that fit within existing workflows. Anything that's very different from that, that has to go over to the dedicated team. There are a lot of companies out there that are very good at Model S, a lot of companies out there that are very good at Model R. Model C is the toughest. Not too many companies get it right consistently. It is the most difficult, but also the most robust. It's the one that companies need to learn to expand their innovation capabilities. Just to review, Model S, very powerful, but what you get out of it is a very large number of very small projects. Model R, very powerful, but what you get is a consistent series of similar projects. Model C, that's custom innovation. What you get out of that is one special project at a time. Each of the three has a different model for dealing with the performance engine. Model S, we try and squeeze innovation into the slack. Model R, we try and make innovation very performance engine-like. Model C, we recognize the need to separate some incompatible innovation work from day-to-day operations by assigning it to a dedicated team. Thanks for listening in. I hope you enjoyed How Stella Saved the Farm, and let me alert you now that you can learn much more about models S, R, and C in a new book we have coming out in September of 2013, Beyond the Idea. I'll look forward to talking to you more about that book and more about Stella in the near future. Thanks so much for your attention.